Good evening. Located along the River Liffey, Kildare Abbey is one of Ireland's most esteemed monastic houses, and its abbess, arguably the most powerful religious woman in Celtic Ireland from circa AD 500 to 1169. Its great influence was partly due to its founder, Saint Brigid, one of Ireland's three patron saints who established the double monastery in 470. Kildare Abbey survived 7 centuries through internal plundering of the abbey's lands and resources, local political intrigues, Gregorian reforms, Norse pillaging, and Irish clan warfare. But when the English king Henry II, at the behest of Pope Adrian IV, along with his Anglo-Norman knights, implemented an invasion of Ireland in AD 1169, Kildare Abbey, along with hundreds of others, was forced to submit to papal-ordered reform. Subsequently, the Irish Church was restructured to accede to the diocesan organization found in Europe and Britain, one in which the bishoprics held the true power, not the monasteries. The following sources provide a small part of the scholarship that addresses the subject of Irish monasticism, along with the spread of Celtic spirituality, female authority in the medieval Irish Church, the reasons for the slow yet deliberate demise of Celtic monasticism, and the aftermath of the use of military invasion to implement religious dictates. Ireland was forever changed after 1169, both politically and religiously. Examples of what happened to its monasteries, particularly Kildare Abbey, are especially telling. Some of the more noted scholarly works in recent years have focused on Irish monasticism, particularly in relation to women's history. These include University of Southern California professor Lisa M. Bittles' several works, her 2002 work, including Women in Early Medieval Europe, 400 to 1100, as well as her 2009 publication, Landscape with Two Saints, How Genevieve of Paris and Brigid of Kildare Built Christianity in Barbarian Europe. In both books, Bittell discusses the Church's justification for feminine relegation, seen from the patristic age to modern times. Hence, after 1169, the Irish Church increased the patriarchy seen in mainland Europe and Britain through the rise of penitential literature, spoken dogma, ecclesiastical laws, art, and even demeaning feminine forms such as Sheila na gigs found in Anglo-Norman architecture. Although some of these things had been seen previously, much of the stricter patriarchy was ignored due to the secular Brehon law codes which were left over from Ireland's pre-Christian past that protected women in its post-Christian medieval times to some extent. Mary Condren is a professor of gender studies at Trinity College in Dublin. Her 1989 monograph, The Serpent and the Goddess, Women, Religion, and Power in Celtic Ireland, details how Christianity built upon traditional Celtic practices, motifs, and laws, which allowed women a certain measure of authority, such as property owning, inheriting, and selling, divorce rights, as well as rights over children, which were not seen in Latin Europe. For example, a noblewoman might donate lands to build an abbey that she herself would eventually manage. Celtic law codes, as mentioned previously, the Brehon laws, provided women wealth and power, which allowed them this certain type of power, as well in the post-Christian era, in the abbeys especially. Until the coming of the Anglo-Normans in 1169, many of these practices were in place and were eventually forbidden by the English invaders. The resulting change in society thus affected women in all walks of life, both secular and religious. In 2002, Queen's University professor Christina Harrington published Women in a Celtic Church, Ireland 450 to 1150, once again expounding on the work of Bittell and Condren, talking about women in the Irish Church prior to the Anglo-Norman conquest of 1169. It's a very linear discussion, starting with the age of Brigid into the High Middle Ages. Harrington talks particularly about certain abbesses during these times, which are named in the Irish annals, specific monastic houses such as Kildare and Kildare and Clonmacnoise. She talks also about male-female religious relationships, communal associations between monks and nuns, and clerics, especially in the double monasteries. She also talks about women's roles and rights, women, religious women particularly, as foster mothers to foundlings and who also had religious schools at these monasteries. She consults the Irish annals, the hagiographies, secular documents such as land writs and court records, and the result is a cohesive narrative built on documentary evidence of what these women's lives might have entailed. In contrast to Harrington's work, we also have University of Melbourne professor Diane Hall's 2008 work, Women in the Church in Medieval Ireland, circa 1140 to 1540. Hall provides a fantastic investigative timeline post-Anglo-Norman invasion, so something that's been missing in many of the texts which talk about the pre-invasion time. There's not a lot of secondary sources talking about the post-invasion time, but she rectifies this, Hall rectifies this. So beginning with displaying how she talks about the Gregorian reforms of the early 12th century and talking about how this led eventually to the invasion, which implemented restructuring of the Irish Church. And she ends by talking about King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the early 16th century and how religious women and their close ties to local communities and their associations with patronages among lay women expanded actually after the Anglo-Norman conquest. So many of the sources talk about how women's roles were limited after the conquest, but in summary, we actually have a lot more documentary evidence of women's roles after the Anglo-Norman conquest. And part of this has to do with, in later medieval times, there's just more surviving evidence. Hall asserts that Irish Catholic nuns continued their public mission even after they were held to stricter cloistering rules under the incoming Cistercian Augustinian orders that were implemented after the invasion of 1169. Other than this, there's not a whole lot of secondary sources, but there are a few. There were some honorable mentions. This is just a minor sampling, but we also have Celtic historian Brian Wright's 2009 biography of St. Brigid titled Brigid, Goddess, Druid, and Saint, which poses the notion that Brigid was probably the last Druid priestess at Kildare, who, sensing the changing of paganism to Christianity, converted to Christianity with the express purpose of being able to continue to lead her followers without interruption at Kildare. I've also consulted Gillian Kenny's 2007 text, Anglo-Irish and Gaelic Women in Ireland, circa 1170 to 1540, also building upon Hall's work regarding how women in the church and secular society changed after the conquest of 1169. And finally, Christine Meek and Catherine Sims' 1996 work, The Fragility of Her Sex, Medieval Irish Women in Their European Contexts, which poses how Irish women were compared to medieval women in Europe, mainland Europe, and Britain during this time. So contemporary Irish work after the conquest as well. One of the gaps that this dissertation hopes to address is the exclusivity of Kildare Abbey as a focal point for both the double monastic tradition as well as women in Ireland and women's roles in Ireland, especially the abbess of Kildare and her preeminent role as Brigid's successor. The abbey itself survived restructuring and building. It was raided many times. It was plundered by the Norse Vikings. It was plundered by Irish clans. It actually had huge secular associations with the Leinster kings. It spanned 7 centuries, and there is enough primary source evidence to relay what occurred throughout most of its history before and after the comings of the Anglo-Normans in 1169. Moreover, the rich ancillary stories of St. Brigid herself, female and male Irish contemplatives, and even contrasting stories of European religious women during this time help in the overall study. All can be told within the purview of this one monastic house. In short, there is no single work dedicated to dissecting the history of Kildare Abbey in scholarly works out there. So putting this exclusively within the core of Irish and indeed Catholic Church history will be novel in that respect. Thank you very much for listening to my dissertation proposal. I hope everyone has a wonderful and fantastic summer. Thank you.